Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this property law update on financing property investments, particularly looking at installment sale agreements. Now, just as a brief introduction, many of you already know who I am. For those of you that don't, my name is Bruno Simao. I'm a specialist property attorney. Um, I run a number of different property-related companies and businesses, including companies dealing with brokering, with investment structuring, tax advice, and obviously the firm of attorneys that deals with all the legal issues. I've been in this industry now for almost going on 15 years. My background's in litigation and commercial work, and almost since the beginning, I've been predominantly focusing on property law. So it is one of my niches. So with when dealing with property investments, we often need to become very creative on how we approach it. And this is important because there's a lot of people out there that might, for example, not have enough capital at this moment, or already stretched too thin and see great deals and want to get involved in these deals. And there's plenty of ways of doing it. And I mean, your conventional ways of financing deals are still very, very important. I mean, the likes of Miguel and Christian will speak to you about getting financing from a bank, which is important, especially for rather large deals, and to acquire as much of the revenue as possible right from the outset. But there's a couple of situations that might merit consideration of alternative creative ways of doing things. And this is where we generally this is around the topic of financing property investments and how we go about doing it. Installment sale agreements, or rather, instead of labeling it as an installment sale agreement, which in our law has specific definition, I prefer to look at it just as an installment agreement, um, uh, basically where a purchaser is able to buy a property, which is a rather large investment, and the purchase price is rather huge over a period of time, and they get to pay it off over a period of time, as opposed necessarily to taking a loan from a bank where you're paying the bank off. Now, our approach is how do we interact with the seller so that the seller does not require the sum of money all at once, but rather maybe over a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the case might be. Before we start getting into the installment sale agreements, um, I, I'd I'd rather prefer giving a certain example or scenario so that you guys can kind of wrap your head around. And this is a scenario that I was personally involved in last year, relating to the purchase of a property from a gentleman who was in financial distress, required a certain amount of money quite urgently, and didn't really mind when the rest was going to come in. So we were in a position where we were able to negotiate that we give him the sum that he requires. This would possibly get him out of debt and afford him the opportunity of purchasing a couple of things that he desperately needed to purchase. By affording him this opportunity and giving him access to this money, he was more willing and obviously was able to negotiate a deal when it came to the payment of the rest of the purchase price. So we went in with a reasonably low offer, which he was not happy with initially to begin with. But um, after having proposed the payment of the deposit, that was a rather large sum. I think in this instance, we offered around 300,000 Rand. He was quite happy. So he was smiling from ear to ear. He knew he was getting 300,000 Rand in his pocket right from the beginning. And I'm going to touch on the risks of this in a second, but he was very happy, and he didn't mind when he was going to get the rest of his, I think it was 1.3 million or 1.2 million, which gave us the opportunity of being able to negotiate paying this off over a period of time. So before I go into the legalities of that, the one thing I always touch on first, and the reason I do this first is because I need to impress on people that getting into property investments requires you to apply yourself to um, to the investment journey right from the outset. I mean, this includes investing in your education with companies such as Property Academy, for example, investing in your network such as Sapin. But one of the things that does require some attention is investing in your own infrastructure, your own structuring on how you're going to hold these investments. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And every Sapin event, I do touch on a few just to get everyone a general idea on things to look out for. But when it comes to installment sale agreements, we need to now start considering from a structuring perspective how exactly we want to do this. It's an installment sale agreement. Is it any different to any other form of sale agreement that you entered into? And the answer is it is very different. It is still a very long-term strategy, or generally tends to be a long-term strategy. You can enter into installment sale agreements for the purposes of flipping. And as I've mentioned before a couple of times, if you're going to do a capital flip, I generally, I generally don't mind if people do it in their own names. If they know that they're going to sell it, obviously the risk that you don't sell it is there, and then you're stuck with it in your own name. Or you can even do it through a trust. There's a couple of ways that we can, that you structure your tax so that you get the best tax benefit. Doing a flip through a company, for example, sometimes does tend to be a little bit expensive. But again, everyone's personal circumstances would dictate what choices they make. But if you're not going to flip, and the idea is to keep this in your name, same general principles that I've spoken to you guys about before apply. It is a long-term investment. That means that you'd want to keep it inside some form of entity that has a continuity. So that doesn't pass away the same way that a human being would pass away, but that continues indefinitely, beyond somebody's own lifetime. So those principles tend to remain the same. Insofar as your structuring during the installment sale agreement is concerned, just bear in mind that it is important to remember that you're not out of the clear when it comes to your financing, because if for some reason the seller at any point passes away or becomes insolvent, you do need to act on this agreement immediately. Unfortunately, you won't be in a position where you can just carry on paying in installments. When it comes to insolvencies, they will give you an option to pay the remaining purchase price immediately. Otherwise, unfortunately, they may need to sell the property to somebody else. So it is important that even during this entire process, that you always stay cognizant that you may at some point need to apply for financing, even if the risk is small, just in case there is insolvency at some point. Now, when it comes to the financing property investments and the strategies that we tend to use, I've always discussed with you guys the institutional financing, loans from banks, or loans from joint ventures from private individuals. There's the no financing options of doing back-to-back flips where you don't use any of your own money. But today, the primary focus is obviously on seller financing. Now, seller financing, the two legal strategies, or the two legal options that we tend to refer to the most, are installment sale agreements. Now, this is governed by the Alienation of Land Act. Alienation of Land Act is legislation that we have for the sales of property, and there's specific sections there that regard alienation of the land by way of an installment. Now, this is actually great, especially for a property purchaser, because it means that you're very well protected, and not just in our contract, you're protected by way of legislation. And I'll tell you guys why in a second. There is a second option. And now the difference between these options. So there I refer, in the slides I refer to sale with customs brief, but don't worry too much about the terminology. The primary difference between an installment sale agreement in terms of the Alienation of Land Act and this sale that I'm referring to with a customs brief simply is that if you're buying the property in installments, you don't take transfer of the property until the very end, or until you're ready to pay the purchase price or secure the balance of the purchase price. Whereas if you're doing it, for example, a customs brief, all that really means is you start treating the seller as though the seller is the bank. So the same way that you'd apply to a bank for a loan, the bank would give the money to the seller, and you would buy the property, take transfer of the property into your name, and start paying the bank back. The only difference now is that you're paying the seller back. So these two options, the biggest differences that you guys need to consider is the one, transfer takes place only after you're done with your payments. The second transfer takes place before you even start with your payments. So obviously, as a property investor, you'd want to push for option number two. And in the example that I told you right at the beginning that I was involved in last year, we actually managed to convince the owner to go for option number two. He was willing to give us the transfer of the property, and we would then pay him back in installments. Why would he do that? And this is where the question of security comes in. So what are the differences in security when it comes to these two different options? So an installment sale agreement for a purchaser, so a seller naturally has security because he hasn't passed the transfer on to the purchaser yet. So the fact that he still owns the property is security for himself. But now here I go, pay 300,000 to the seller. What security do I have? Since I don't own the property, what can I do? And the great thing about the Alienation of Land Act is it requires that the installment sale agreement be registered against the title deed to the property. So what this effectively means is if the seller tries to go sell the property without you knowing, that he will not be able to, because your agreement is endorsed against the title deed, and transfer of this property will not take place unless you're aware of it and you consent to it, or your sale agreement is somehow removed from the title deed, which can only happen naturally if you agree or if you're in breach of the agreement. So this is a form of security, meaning that every single installment that you pay and every deposit that you pay is to a certain degree secured, because no one's going to do anything with the property without you knowing. So you are protected as a purchaser, and that is a great mechanism to buy properties, because you're not just protected in terms of a contract which you need to go to court to sue. You're actually protected with a real right that is known to the public at large through the deeds office. Now, with the second option, where transfer is already passed to you, what security does the seller have? In this instance, that you've bought the property, you haven't paid them the purchase price, but they're willing to give you the property. How do they know that you're going to pay? And remember when I mentioned to you that this is very similar to the way that you'd approach a bank. The only difference is now it's the seller, not the bank. And it almost applies the very same way. So a bank, when they lend you money, they generally take a mortgage bond over the property. A mortgage bond, all that means is that the property is held in security. And in security, if you fail to make your repayments of the loan, they are able to sell this property in order to recover the loan amount. That is what a mortgage is. And it's security because, again, like an installment sale agreement, it's registered against the title deed, meaning that no one can try sell this property without that creditor knowing. So all that happens in this instance is the same way that a bank registers a mortgage bond, the seller would now register a mortgage bond, and you would be repaying the seller. And if for some reason you default, the seller would be entitled to call up the mortgage and sell the property on auction to recover the loan amount, which effectively is the balance of the purchase price. So these are really great tools to use. There's a lot pertaining to strategy when it comes to this, and the most important ones that I tend to tell clients that they have to consider is, as a property investor, you're looking to pay as little as possible to get as much of a return as possible. So if investing, for example, in distressed properties where people are in need of money, the one thing that you need to make sure that you cover is the mortgage bond payments, because you do not want a bank who has a mortgage over this property to foreclose, because even though you've bought it as an installment sale agreement, you're not protected from the bank foreclosing. So first and foremost, make sure that you're paying the mortgage bond and you're paying it directly to the bank, because you are entitled to ask that the bank supply you with statements showing what is outstanding on that account. So that is something that I insist on, because it's the only real security that you have, that the main creditor, the one creditor that could probably beat you when it came to a security, that at least they're covered. Very similarly, I'd also have some level of interaction with the municipality, making sure that property rates and the like are paid. So how would you go about doing this? It's all in the contract. And the wording of the contract would say that a certain purchase price needed to be paid. So let's say, for example, as in my instance, I think it was 1.6 million. What would the monthly installment be? Whatever the monthly installment you want. And so a lot of people go very low and say, well, the equivalent of whatever's payable on the mortgage on a monthly basis, property rates, And yeah, if there's levies, possibly levies. And they try to keep it very low, and they pay those specific amounts, and they expect the seller to pay those amounts through to the service providers and to the banks. So they cover just very, very bare minimum, but it goes towards their purchase price, and it slowly reduces the purchase price. Now, that is one extreme, though, because many sellers would expect you to at least pay the property rates in addition to whatever's payable on the mortgage. So you can take all these figures and you can reduce them against the purchase price. There's some more advanced sellers, so where deals aren't really in a distressed environment, you'll find that some sellers will also insist that some level of occupational rent be paid in addition to that. So now bear in mind, you've got a purchase price and you've possibly got a lease agreement. Now, whatever payments you make, you need to distinguish which ones go against the purchase price and slowly reduce the purchase price, and which ones simply get pocketed by the seller. It's very important that you know which are which, because when you run your calculations on the slow reduction of the purchase price, possibly even considering financing the property, because remember, there's no restriction on how long this installment sale agreement can go for. So you could say 2 years, and at the end of 2 years is a balloon payment, which all that you do is you apply it to the bank for a loan. You can do it 5 years, you can do it 10 years, whatever it takes. It doesn't have to be paid off in all these small little installments. There can be a big payment that you obtain from a bank at a later stage. But obviously, to do that calculation on how much of a loan you're going to need to obtain at the end of the installment sale agreement, you would need to know what actually reduces the purchase price and what would get pocketed by the seller, or what would be paid to the municipality, or whoever it is. So these are just small things to think about when entering into agreements. Make sure that you negotiate with these principles in mind. It's always a pleasure, and if you have any questions, please feel free to give me a shout.